Hello everyone, it's Kyra Wong from the Magical Unicorn Project, and I am here today with one of our supporting men, Mr. Mark Hart. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Kyra. Happy to be here.
The starting point here is I want to know a little bit about how you were raised and that journey to where you are today.
Sure. There's a whole lot to unpack in there, but I was born in Jamaica. I am the son of some Jamaican parents, obviously, and we migrated to Canada when I was 2. Mom and Dad got divorced shortly after arriving in Canada, and so Mom raised the 3 of us. I'm the baby, and I've got 2 older sisters. So my whole life, I've been surrounded by women, and it's been an interesting journey, and the impact has been interesting just to see my mom have to struggle, and I know lots of other people have had similar journeys, in particular from the Caribbean, in particular of Jamaica. But it's been interesting, and it's made an impact on me, and just in terms of just seeing mom struggle and still end up working a couple of jobs. She's a nurse, working a couple of jobs and struggle, but managed to get ahead and buy her own house and just kind of move on and live a little bit of the dream, as it were. So it really helped set a really good example and show me that coming from nothing, you can actually achieve if you're focused and you put some hard work in.
So she was raising you as a single mom from the time you were
2. 3 actually.
3. Okay, and with 2 other
older sisters.
Yeah, that's incredible. So you saw that really strong work ethic from a young age, right?
Very much so, and the discipline to go along with it. It's
So you didn't really have a male role model then?
No, I didn't at all. And it's interesting. Over time, I look back and I don't know really what I missed because it wasn't there.
Yeah.
Mom's always been kind of serving in both roles. Mm-hmm. On Father's Day, I call my mother to say Happy Father's Day. It's just because she's kind of wore both hats. So, yeah. No. So I don't. My father was actually. He passed away last year, but we were never really close. He got remarried, had a couple of kids, and ultimately I ended up being closer to my stepmother, his new wife, and his daughters than I am with him. He was just kind of, just absent.
Yeah. So. Okay, that's interesting. So you've had a lot of success in your life and in your career, and I'm curious about how you got there because I know you had a banking background in your journey, and I remember when I started my project seeing this chart from McKinsey & Company and leanin.org, and it just showed like all these people basically starting out at the bottom all together. So as you started going up the corporate ladder to those C-suite positions, there was pretty much no minorities or women, and it showed these color blocks, right? So the white men at the top, it was like this, and then like this much women, and like this much in terms of minorities. And I thought, wow, like you basically have to be a unicorn to get into a C-suite position, right? And this just came out like a couple years ago. So it's like, so someone like you, I can only imagine the kind of struggles and challenges you would have had to get up there and the discrimination you probably experienced too. So tell me a bit about that.
It's been an interesting journey. And even if you go back when I left school, I left school early. So you kind of layer on to the fact that, didn't graduate, minority. And when I got into the mortgage business in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I grew up, there weren't really a whole lot of people of color either in this business, right? Yeah. So that ended up being a bit of an interesting, presented some interesting challenges at the outset, but like anything else, you work and you connect and you build relationships, you add value. But as many people would say that end up being either female or minority, when you're reaching for some of those positions, you end up in some cases having to work a little harder than potentially other folks on balance, and you just get used to that being the rule or the unwritten rule, as it were. And that's just how it is. But so initially starting out of the gate in finance, it was interesting. And then as you move on to different positions, you get used to it, but you're never really happy with the fact that you have to get used to it. I lived in the States and I worked for a big bank in the US, and I had an executive role with them. And it was interesting, they actually came up with a program to build out bench strength within the female and minority community for mid-level executives.
So what year would this be?
So this would have been 2003 in Atlanta. And this was one of the top 10 big banks in the US. And and what was really driving that wasn't really their sense of, hey, this is something that we have to do. On balance, I think there's probably a small portion of that, but that wasn't the majority reason. What was driving that was they had seen a lot of other companies paying out hundreds of millions of dollars in class action lawsuits for glass ceiling practices, and over time, that gave a lot of big companies some pause, and they felt that, okay, we've got to do something about this, if for no other reason than a defensive measure. But I think, in fairness to them, there's probably some element of that was, hey, this is the right thing to do, because they do, corporations do deserve some level of credit for that. But it was interesting. So there was 15 of us put in this program for 2 years, sorry. And it was a phenomenal program. It was interesting to hear everybody else's stories in there as well. And everybody had, I don't care if you were an Italian mid-level executive female or an Asian executive. Everyone kind of has the similar kind of taste in their mouth, if you will, and similar journeys. So it's fascinating to see that this is alive and well.
Yeah. Well, and even as you're talking about this, it's like I can totally relate and I'm privileged as a white female, but I would be more privileged if I was a white male, right? And somewhere in that corporate climb, I've always felt like I had to work harder.
Yeah, that's just become the frame of reference. That's just become the norm, unfortunately. It's just accepted the fact that you have to go through certain things. And it's interesting to see some of the Me Too movement really starting to give a lot of people pause on some of the old traditions no longer really being acceptable and never perhaps should have been acceptable. So it's starting to, but it's a push. It would be a lot easier if it was a pull.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when there's more men out there, evolved men, as I call them, taking a stand and being like, hey, that's not right, and saying that, it becomes harder for the ones doing it to continue doing it, right? It's hard for 50% of the population to solve the problem when it's something that's happening to us. So it really requires the support, I believe, of strong, involved men to start being like, you know what? That's not the way we roll around here. And it is definitely, I think, getting better, but we're still such a far way from where we should be.
I agree. But the good news is I think getting this awareness out is just the first step. And then starting to engage more and more men, and we've got to figure out a variety of ways and how we can continue to do that, is I think the next logical step in the process. But it's going to be a journey, for sure, and it'll be a long one.
So tell me about the Yellow Brick House, because this is a charity that you've been involved in for years. So I want to know why you got involved in that and why you're passionate about that.
So it's interesting. I've always wanted to give back, and in my earlier years, I was a big brother because I didn't have that. So I was a big brother for about 6 years to a number of boys when I lived in Kitchener-Waterloo. And I always believed in giving back. And my mom, didn't have a ton of money, but she always gave back, and she'd do missionary trips and give half my wardrobe away to people in countries and so on and so forth. And as there's a period in my life about 7 or 8 years ago when I hadn't really been doing as much as I would like in the charitable. Sure, I give to different charities when people send you an invite and you give you $100 and so on and so forth. But I hadn't actually been as actively involved in a charity. So I was looking around at a variety of different charities, and came upon Yellow Brick House, and their mission at supporting abused women and their children really kind of spoke to me. So I met with the board chair and the executive director, and ended up joining the board, and ended up being vice chair, and actually just left the board after 7 years. And it's just a phenomenal organization and what they do. I still say we, because I'm a big supporter of them. Yellow Brick House has a number of shelters for abused women and children, and as I got into the learning more about the cause, it really was fascinating to me how widespread abuse is and the many faces of abuse, whether it's physical, it's emotional, it's financial, psychological. It just has many different components to it, and it's not just for poor people or the middle class. There's lots of believe it or not, there are executive women that would otherwise appear to be strong women in their business role, but they're being psychologically abused by men and end up leaving their house with their child on the heels and in the back of a police car and taken to a shelter, and it's just, you see some of the stories and it's heartbreaking. So that's our corporate charity. We made a commitment, a 4-year, $60,000 commitment, which is significant for a small company.
Yeah, for sure.
A few years ago, and we continue to support them in a variety of different ways. And even growing, I have a son and a daughter. And my son, over the last couple of years, he kind of takes the lead at his school raising money for Yellow Brick House, because he now understands, the impact of what's kind of gone on and what's been going on. And he understands, some of the work that Yellow Brick House does in the community. He goes to an all-boys private school, and he's kind of one of the driving forces to help Yellow Brick House raise funds at his school. So it's a great cause, and I think I'll probably forever be connected to them, because after you get involved in a charity like that, it's hard to just kind of, okay, go, what's the next? Although I'm no longer on the board, I'm still very, very close to the leadership and the cause.
Okay, that's cool. I want to switch gears a little bit and just ask you about racism, because I feel like racism
does that exist still?
Well, only I think so, because sexism does, and I think sexism and racism are very similar in many ways, right? So how have you been impacted? And I'm not even asking. I'm saying how. I'm not saying have you. I'm saying because I know you have to be. So how have you been impacted by racism?
Well, it's interesting. If you really kind of have to go back to just growing up, right, and experiencing it firsthand. When you're a kid, most times I was raised, as I said, in Kitchener-Waterloo, which was primarily a German town back in the day, and there weren't really, there wasn't a whole lot of diversity. There was the odd black kid. Usually, you ended up being the only black kid in the class, right? And there was the odd brown kid and maybe the odd Asian kid, but outside of that, there was very, very minimal diversity. And to you, obviously, it never really mattered, but you got called the N-word on the playground, and obviously you had to stand up for yourself in whatever ways you can. And over time, you just get used to being that only one in the class or that only black broker at golf tournaments, and it just doesn't even faze you, just because that's just become your frame of reference, like what we talked about before. And but over time, even professionally, I was an executive. I had an executive role at one of the big banks, and I didn't. Again, I'm going in thinking that I'm coming to work here and I'm looking to do a job, and I don't think that was necessarily the driving reason why they hired me per se. At least I don't think that was the case. But I remember getting a call from the gentleman that ran the Black Employee Network, and who was obviously a white guy, because from what I understand, I was the only black executive at the bank, so there wasn't one before I was hired. He said, hey, listen, the Black Employee Network heard you were hired, and they'd love to meet you, and so on, and realized at that point, I was like, oh, okay. I guess I am the only one out of the 250 executives inside the bank that's the case. But, you go through life, seeing the various faces of racism, and in some cases it's very, very overt, where you get the look in the eyeball and you get the N-word, and you get it, in Canada, I would argue that it's much more covert than in the US, right? You see the marches that we've seen on CNN, the KKK and so on and so forth, and much more of an overt culture. And I think maybe that has to do with slavery being such a prevalent thing in the in the 1800s and so on in the US, and so there's still some of that stuff kind of bubbling. Not so deep underground, if you will, in the U.S. But I think in Canada we've had a bit of a different kind of a socialization, and cultural diversity is much more accepted here, and promoted by even the politicians for the most part. But I'm not naive enough to think it's still not there. And here's a classic example of how current the racism is. My kid goes to my son, before he went to the private school, we had him in a public school, and he gets the N-word on the playground. And he was having a conversation with his friend, and this guy taps him on the shoulder and says, "Why don't you just shut up?" And my son's saying, "What are you talking about? I'm not even talking to you." And the guy says, I should take you to my church and hang you on the cross and call you holy, S-H-I, go on. And it just shows you, and this is at that point, my son is a 9 or 10-year-old kid, right? And this is in the Greater Toronto area at a school. And I ended up having a conversation with the superintendent of the school for the region, and I spoke with the head of diversity for the school, and I asked them, so what exactly are you guys doing to promote diversity? Besides the one day of the year in February, or maybe you talk about Black History Month a little bit, but you kind of walk through some of the different events, and he says, we got to do a lot better. But it's like sexism. It is a long journey
Of broken glass.
Exactly. It's tough not to look at it any other way. And I would think that on the sexism side, as a minority, I think, I don't know, it's probably 8 or 10% of people are Black. But when you see 50% of the people in Canada or the world are female, it's hard to see why. While I'm happy that there's one minority executive at TD, Barrett Misrani, it's just you can't convince me why there isn't a female executive today
at a major bank.
At a major bank, it's good to see corporately, globally. There's a bunch, Indra Nooyi at Pepsi and others, but in Canada, I'm surprised we haven't been as accepting, and I think we've got a long way to go. We haven't actually held our corporations that haven't adopted much more proactive policies at diversity and both in the gender and also in the minority side. We haven't really held them to account as well as we could.
So maybe because Canadians are less litigious than Americans.
I think that's a driving reason. I think that's a big reason why. And it's a much smaller denominator of population as well. So some of the law firms, I understand, probably don't want to, and the big banks drive a lot of opportunity. So if you're going to go after one of the big banks, you have to be resigned to the fact that, okay, I'm no longer going to be getting work from them forever, kind of thing. But I think, honestly, I think that the litigious part of it is a big driving reason why some of the corporations in the U.S. have come around, because they don't want to. There's economic reasons why they don't want to keep cutting couple $100 million checks. Yeah. But it's unfortunate, and I could go on and on and on with racism examples, unfortunately, and I don't wear it on my sleeve up until you and I just you had asked me to have this conversation with you. I don't no one really has asked me, just because I'm just a friend, I'm just Mark, and that's the way that we all want to be treated. But if someone actually sat down and asked me the question, I can give you no end of examples, and for all of my friends that are similar culture, Black or brown. Mm-hmm. Or Asian, doesn't matter. Everybody's gone through it. Yeah. And continues to go through it on some level. Yeah,
absolutely. So how's that affected you? Like somewhere, you're somebody who's been able to take lemons and make lemonade, right? Because you've done very well in your life and you're a strong person, you're a good person. How have you been able to take that negativity and convert it into a superpower that you use to rocket your success in life? Because it's so easy to go another way.
Yeah, what I think I harken back to the example that my mother said. It's just and it's interesting.
My mama said.
Exactly. You got to put the work in, right? You can't feel sorry for yourself. You've at the end of the day, you've got to get over whatever challenge it is. Whether you're sad, you're sick, you don't want to succumb to the burden that the world puts on you or that people put on you. You know who you are, you're comfortable in your own skin, and you set your goals and your objectives, and you hold yourself accountable for achieving those objectives despite whatever challenges that we have, and everybody has challenges. People that are, in the context of this conversation, one could make a pretty good argument that women and minorities have maybe another layer of challenges, but everybody has challenges, and whatever those challenges are, you've got to get over them, because we all have the same 24 hours in a day, and we all have opportunities, whatever they may be, to succeed. And I think I've been pretty good at building relationships with people, and building some areas of connection, and holding on to some of those relationships over time. And I've been fortunate that there've been a bunch of people that have kind of helped me along the line, and kind of given me a push. But I've not let some of those challenges kind of absorb into me, and I really just kind of used some of them to help propel me forward. And I think it's, even going back to that example with my son back 5 years ago, so he sees that, that's not right, right? Because he didn't, when the kids called me N-word, he'd never even heard the word before. He didn't know what it was. He was just kind of like, okay, well, what's this all about? So we asked him at the end of the day, how was school today? And he said, oh yeah, this happened. And we were like, what? What do you mean that happened? So, but he sees how we responded to it, so now he's learning, right? Yeah. So when I was his age, I didn't have that luxury. I just absorbed it because, my mom was working 2 jobs, and it was like, okay, just figure it out for yourself, right? And so you've really had to kind of learn to deal with it, and now we're teaching our kids to learn to deal with it, and the fact that they know that this exists, right, at a young age, and this is how you deal with it, and you have to really, kind of push back and let people that are involved in those situations that are either aiming that at you know that no, we're not going to stand for that, and this is how we're going to kind of deal with it. So but like sexism, it's a journey. I'm not naive enough to think that this is going to be a problem that's going to be solved anytime soon, but it's like anything else, it's a challenge. You adapt, and you grow from it. Ultimately, it does make you stronger.
And I think you just have to keep talking about it, right? And talking about it from like a place that isn't angry. Do you know what I mean? Right. Because especially with my project, obviously injustice makes us angry. We're human, right? So there can be a bit of a fire in you, but I think to respond from a place of, okay, like, from a place of honestly compassion, because I almost feel like the types of people who are racist or sexist or whatever, I mean, something is wrong inside of them, something's going wrong inside of them, because if you're not coming from a place of love and compassion, you're coming from a weaker place, and that's all there is to it, right? So for me, I think it's important to help those people evolve and do it from a compassionate place, even though what they're doing hurts and it's unjust, right?
You're absolutely right. And as you were talking, it was interesting. I keep harkening back to that same situation a few years ago with my son, and we brought it up to the principal, and the principal said, let's maybe get their parents in a room and you in a room, and let's have a restorative conversation. And that was probably a missed opportunity by my part, because I said no thanks, because I'm just so angry, right? And it takes a lot for me to get angry. Anybody that knows me, I'm not an aggressive person. I'm not a violent person. But it's just there's a point at which you cross, and like
yes, and your hot justice button goes off.
Correct, especially when it involves your kid, right? Throw racism in there and your kid. Okay, all bets are off now.
I can relate.
Right. So it's but that was one situation where, in hindsight, if I could have kind of got with it, it would have been interesting to understand where those people were coming from, because wherever that is, for that level of toxicity to come out of a kid's mouth, where does that come from? It has to come from home, right? The values that his parents are espousing to their kid, and they're just kind of taking it and running with it, right? So part of me thought, geez, there's one. I could have been potentially a bigger person, but I just couldn't do it
in that moment.
But you're right, though. I think it really has to be a dialogue and trying to get an understanding where people are coming from, because they're coming from somewhere with this, and it's just interesting to see how people have developed their view of people and how that impacts what they say and how they behave towards us, towards people of minority. But it's something we've got to continue. But it does begin with a conversation, and I think, unfortunately, when something like that's heaped upon you, something like that meaning some kind of treatment or something verbal, then unfortunately it's on us to take it, absorb it, and then come back with what you and I are talking about in terms of opening up a dialogue and trying to understand why. That's a challenge to do when someone's basically giving you one of those, right? It's like, okay.
That's why I do this like a gentle little unicorn. It's very non-threatening, very approachable. And it's like, let's have a nice conversation about this.
Right, but meanwhile...
I'm gonna stab you with my horn! No. No, this is to remind us that we are all one in our humanity. We shouldn't see colors, we shouldn't really see genders, unless we're seeing it in a positive and inclusive kind of way, right? The color of your skin shouldn't matter, your gender shouldn't matter, who you choose to love shouldn't matter. We are one in our humanity.
Right,
and that's
right. We didn't even talk about our LGBTQ community. They're in the same bucket as we are.
There's a lot of us in there.
Yeah. It's getting crowded.
It is getting crowded. And in a way, they have a very hard time because when you're black, right, you are loved by the rest of your black family, theoretically, right? When you're somebody who's in that kind of a community, you can be completely booted out and ostracized and no longer exist to family members because it's just so intolerable, right? Intolerable for people to accept, and especially religious people, I think, really struggle with it, right? So, anyways,
that's madness, but that's so.
It's madness, but in closing, what is a message you would like to leave the world today?
On the gender front, I think for those of us those of us being men that can't quite. They're having a hard time with the emergence of female opportunity. It's called get over it. This is a long time coming, and I think it's the right thing to do. I don't think it can happen fast enough. And you look at the benefit of and how quickly women can do well if given the opportunity. You look at the examples, and how can you even how can you not see that this is something that's right and it's appropriate and it's long overdue. So I think for the guys, it's called get over it. On the racism front, I don't even know what to say there. I think that it's great to see the world kind of continuing to evolve. You look at some of the stuff that's going on culturally, where people are getting killed and stuff like that. But as far as leaving a message, I think, you go back to the old days when your mother gave you that example, treat others as you'd be treated, right? And it really is an old saying, but a very simple one. But I think that's ultimately, that's
golden rule.
The golden rule.
Yeah. I think of people as a rainbow, because it just goes so well with unicorns, but within there is a spectrum of colors, right? And it's the diversity of those colors that make a rainbow beautiful. And the world is really no different, right? But we need to level up and get there as humanity so that everybody can be treated equally and embrace our oneness. And that's all there is to it. It's actually very simple. Love people, every people, all the people.
Amen, sister.
Amen. Thank you. You're the best.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Good to be with you.